Hello, and welcome to English class this new semester. You're going to have lots of fun, and we are going to start by reading our new story on page 170 of your textbook. I am going to be reading with you, so go ahead, find your textbook and read along with me, all right? It says The First Great Road Trip, okay, written by Noel Yaney Child and photo selection by Monica Delgado de Patruco. And it starts on May 19, 1903, a fateful argument broke out in San Francisco, California. Several men claimed that automobiles were just a passing fad. Imagínate, okay? Horseless carriages were too unreliable to be useful. Drivers spent more time making roadside repairs than they spent behind the steering wheel. Besides, the men argued only roads were smooth enough for car travel. A wealthy young auto enthusiast from Vermont disagreed. His name was Dr. Horatio Nelson Jackson. Jackson argued that a car could cross the continent. The men laughed. Someone bet $50 that no one could drive to New York City in less than 3 months. Jackson jumped at the challenge, declaring that he would make the trip himself. Okay? Lo retaron a ir en un road trip. Okay? ¿Saben lo que es un road trip? Andar en carro por mucho y largo tiempo. Okay? Cruzando tal vez de un estado a otro, o si están en Europa, por ejemplo, de un país a otro. Jackson gave himself just a few days to get ready. He hired a skilled auto mechanic named Sewell K. Crocker to be his co-driver. Crocker worked in a nearby gasoline engine factory. He knew cars from the inside out. Crocker advised Jackson to buy a car made by the Winton Motor Carriage Company. It will carry you through, if anything will, he assured Jackson. With no time to order a new Winton, Jackson convinced a local man to sell his used 1903 Winton. The auto had 2 worn rear tires, but it would have to do. Jackson nicknamed the car the Vermont, after his home state. Jackson and Crocker removed the Vermont's rear seat to make room for supplies. The men packed camping gear, tools, rope, and the only spare tire they could find. To save space, the men did not bring a tent. Instead, they planned to sleep under the car. Finally, Jackson strapped on containers for extra fuel. There were no gas stations in 1903. However, general stores in most towns stocked fuel for stoves. The men also outfitted themselves. Early cars were designed to show off the driver. Eran descapotados, ¿no? They had no tops and no windows. They did not even have windshields. Jackson and Crocker packed long raincoats in case of bad weather. They wore goggles to keep wind, dust, and bugs out of their eyes. Jackson and Crocker left for New York on May 23. Word of their daring trip was already spreading on newspapers. Reporters were on the scene. One reporter declared that Jackson and Crocker's journey would be watched with a great deal of interest. Recuerden que era the first great road trip, la primera vez que se hacía esto. He was right. Other people had tried and failed to cross the country by automobile. Several cars had become stuck in the sands of Nevada. To avoid Nevada, Jackson and Crocker detoured north through Oregon. The detour would make the trip 1,000 miles longer. Just 2 days into their journey, Jackson and Crocker got lost. There were no road maps and street signs. No había Google Maps tampoco para ese tiempo. Whenever possible, the men followed railroads. However, parts of the route had no railroad lines. Jackson and Crocker came across a red-haired woman on a horse. They asked her for directions, and she pointed them down a road. The men followed the lane for miles. They were surprised when it ended at a lonely farmhouse. A family came out and stared at the Vermont. Then they sent the men back the way they had come. Later that day, Jackson sent a telegram to his wife. He wrote, "We went back and met the red-haired young woman again. Why did you send us way down there? I asked her. I wanted Pa, Ma, and my husband to see you, she said. They had never seen an automobile before. Ellos le piden direcciones y ella los envía a su casa para que su papá, su mamá y su esposo los vean. Qué interesante. In the northeastern corner of California, the rear tires of the Vermont wore out. Jackson had to order new tires and other parts. Then he and Crocker waited for a Wells Fargo stagecoach to bring the goods. It took more than a week. Meanwhile, people came from miles around to see the Vermont. One newspaper reported one would think that a circus was coming to town. They purchased a bulldog named Bud. On June 6, the Vermont headed east through 300 miles of unmarked desert. There was no rail line to follow. Still, the men managed to find the next town on their route. Later that month, Jackson and Crocker added a mascot to their team. Añadieron una mascotita. In Idaho, they purchased a bulldog named Bud. Jackson immediately fitted the dog with driving goggles. Wearing his goggles, Bud bounced along happily in the front seat as the Vermont climbed the Sawtooth Mountains. Para no estar solitos, se compraron un perrito. Muy interesante. The Vermont crossed into Wyoming. Around June 20, the Vermont crossed into Wyoming. Storms washed out the roads near the rail lines. They had to zigzag through the countryside, going miles out of their way. They became mired in the mud again and again. Every time Jackson thought the worst was behind them, the Vermont suffered another breakdown. One frustrated telegram from Jackson to his wife simply read, "Rain wash out the bum roads and log, broken spring crawl to Rollins." More than once, Jackson had to order parts directly from the Winton factory in Ohio. He and Crocker were delayed for weeks waiting for parts to arrive by train. News arrived that another pair of men was trying to cross the continent by car, así que los imitaron y otros más querían hacer también este viaje. They were sponsored by the Packard Motor Car Company. The Packard team had a more direct route and was experiencing better luck. It was catching up with the Vermont. Jackson and Crocker's drive had become a race. Ahora estaban como en una competencia, ¿verdad? De quién llegaba primero, porque ellos salieron primero, pero los otros tenían una mejor dirección. The second half of the Vermont trip went much smoother than the first. In Nebraska, Jackson, Crocker, and Bud drove an incredible 250 miles in one day. On July 12, they reached Omaha, where a huge crowd greeted the Vermont. By now, people across the country were following their progress. News reports joked that the car arrived covered in half a ton of Nebraska clay. The Vermont was in Chicago by July 17, in Cleveland the day after that. Soon, Crocker, Jackson, and Bud were following the Erie Canal through New York. Sometimes they even drove at night in their hurry to beat the Packard team to New York City. Jackson strapped a lamp onto the front of the car for a headlight. Así que no tenía luz, y él le puso una lamparita. Then the Vermont crashed. Thankfully, no one was injured. Afraid of disaster, Jackson and Crocker examined the car. It was damaged but still run. Mechanics worked all night to make repairs. Jackson was eager to get back on the road. He wrote to his wife, "Watch me now, come to you." Jackson, Crocker, and Bud, acuérdense del perrito, drove triumphantly into New York City on July 26, 1903. It was 4:30 a.m. and the streets were deserted, but once people awoke, they flocked to the garage where the Vermont was parked. People across the nation celebrated the team's success. They had become the first people to drive the automobile across the United States. Así que estos fueron los primeros que hicieron este road trip a través de los Estados Unidos. The trip had taken the men 68 days, 68 días, 12 hours and 30 minutes. They had made it in less than 3 months. Jackson had won his bet. He had also spent $8,000 on the car, supplies, repairs, and travel expenses. Jackson said it was worth every cent and pound to win that $50 bet. Okay? Para ganar una apuesta de $50, gastó $8,000. The Vermont made one more trip. It carried Jackson and Bud home to Vermont. As Jackson pulled the car into his barn, it broke down for the last time. Se dañó cuando lo llevó de vuelta a su casa. Inspired by Jackson and Crocker, many other men and women drove across the continent. By 1925, more than 10 million Americans owned automobiles. A coast-to-coast highway had been built. The federal government had mapped out a system of numbered roadways across the nation. The automobile was clearly more than just a fad. More than 100 years ago, two daring young men and a dog named Bud set out to complete a long journey across the United States. They wanted to prove that the automobile was a new way to travel even long distances. They were the first of many more travelers who wanted to see the United States from road. Today, the Vermont and Bud's goggles are displayed in the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. to remind us of this very first cross-country trip. Nice, huh? Esto es un poquito de historia. This is a little bit of history of that first road trip that people made in a car. Okay? See you later for more. Bye-bye. If you need to go back and read again, just do so that you can understand. If you have any questions, just contact me. Bye-bye.